Somewhere in a warm Texas afternoon, a fire ant colony is going about its business. Tens of thousands of workers moving in perfect coordination, patrolling their territory, feeding their queen, expanding their tunnels. They have survived pesticide campaigns, flooding, and the full force of the American agricultural industry, throwing money and chemicals at them for nearly 9 decades. They have outlasted government programs. They have outlasted the politicians who funded those programs. They have spread from a single Alabama port to over 300 million acres across 13 states, and nothing that humans have thrown at them has meaningfully slowed them down. Until one afternoon, when a fly hovers over the colony. This fly is smaller than a grain of rice. It does not sting, it does not spray anything. It simply hovers, drifting in erratic circles above the foraging workers, and within seconds, something extraordinary happens. The colony panics. Workers scatter. Foragers retreat underground. The entire workforce of a colony that fears almost nothing suddenly abandons the food it was collecting and hides, because they recognize what this fly is. Because this fly has spent millions of years evolving into something they cannot fight, cannot outrun, and cannot recover from. This fly is a decapitating fly. And Texas has been releasing thousands of them on purpose. In the next 25 to 30 minutes, we are going inside one of the most unusual pest control programs in American history. We are going to talk about the science, the biology, the economics, and the very strange arms race playing out between fire ants and a tiny South American fly for millions of years. And what all of it means for you, your yard, your pets, your wallet, and the future of one of the most expensive invasive species disasters this country has ever seen. Because this is not just a story about a fly. This is a story about what it actually costs to live in fire ant country. And it turns out that cost is almost incomprehensible. If this is the kind of content you want more of, real science, real history, and real money-saving intelligence that most channels never touch, subscribe right now and hit the bell. We cover low-cost living from every angle, including the angles that come at you from under the ground. Now let's talk about how America got into this situation in the first place. The red imported fire ant Solenopsis invicta is not from here. It evolved in the seasonally flooded savannas of South America, specifically in the Pantanal region straddling Brazil, Bolivia, and Paraguay. In those ecosystems, it developed one of the most aggressive survival strategies in the insect world. When floodwaters rose, fire ant colonies would link their bodies together to form living rafts, keeping the queen and larvae dry in the center, while workers sealed the structure with interlocking legs and jaws. They could float like that for weeks. They could drift for miles, and when they touched dry ground, they could rebuild a colony from scratch within hours. This was not a vulnerable insect. This was an insect built for catastrophe. Nobody planned to bring it to the United States. Best evidence suggests it arrived as a stowaway in soil ballast from ships docking at the port of Mobile, Alabama, sometime in the 1930s. The exact year is disputed. Some records point to 1933. Others suggest multiple introduction events through the 1940s. The early years of the invasion went largely unnoticed because the ants were still spreading through rural areas and the scale of what was coming was not yet legible. By the time agricultural researchers and extension agents in Alabama and Mississippi began filing formal reports about unusually aggressive ant mounds, destroying farm equipment, killing livestock, and hospitalizing workers, the ants had already established populations across a geography large enough that eradication was essentially off the table. This is a recurring pattern with invasive species. They expand quietly for years before anyone in a position to respond understands what they are looking at. What is not disputed is what happened after arrival. In South America, Solenopsis invicta exists inside a web of predators, parasites, pathogens, and competitors that have co-evolved to keep its population in balance. In Alabama in 1933, none of those controls existed. What existed was rich, warm soil, abundant food, mild winters, and an entire continent that had never seen this animal before and had no idea what to do about it. By the 1950s, fire ants had spread across the Gulf Coast states. By the 1970s, they had pushed into the Carolinas. By the 1990s, they had crossed into the southwestern states, and today their range covers over 320 million acres across 14 states, plus Puerto Rico, multiple Caribbean islands, and established populations in Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, and parts of China and Japan. The USDA estimates that fire ants now affect approximately 40 million people in this country. That is not the population of fire ant country. That is the number of people who will be stung this year. The economic cost is where this story becomes something that should make every homeowner in the southern United States genuinely angry. The USDA puts the annual economic damage from red imported fire ants at approximately $6.7 billion per year. That figure includes crop losses, damage to farm equipment, losses in livestock production. Fire ants kill calves, piglets, and newborn deer by attacking their eyes and airways, and veterinary costs for pets. It includes damage to electrical equipment because fire ants are attracted to electrical fields and have destroyed transformers, junction boxes, traffic signal systems, and HVAC units across the South in numbers that utility companies track as a separate budget line. One utility company in Texas documented over $14 million in fire ant-related equipment damage over a 5-year period, not across the whole state, but within a single service territory. Multiply that number across the dozens of utilities operating in fire ant country, and you begin to understand how one line item on a pest damage report becomes a systemic infrastructure cost that everyone absorbs through their utility bills without knowing it. The figure also includes the cost of chemical treatments, and it includes medical care, because fire ant stings can cause anaphylactic shock, and several hundred Americans are hospitalized every year for fire ant reactions, with a small number dying. For the average homeowner in an infested area, fire ants are not a background inconvenience. They are an ongoing expense. A standard mound treatment with broadcast granular bait costs between $15 and $40 per application. Most entomologists recommend treating twice a year minimum. A full perimeter barrier treatment for a quarter-acre lot using liquid insecticide runs between $80 and $200 per professional application. And in heavily infested soil, you will be repeating those applications constantly. Because chemical treatments do not eliminate colonies. They knock populations down. The queens survive in deep chambers. The foragers you kill are replaced within weeks. Bait programs require precise timing and reapplication schedules that most homeowners do not maintain correctly. The pest control industry loves fire ants because they generate continuous repeat customers for a product that only partially works. This is the economic reality that researchers at Texas A&M University and the USDA Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service started confronting seriously in the late 1980s. They were spending enormous sums on chemical suppression, and the ants were not losing. Every independent population study showed that chemical treatment programs slowed local expansion temporarily, but had no measurable effect on the total range. You could spend $6.7 billion a year managing fire ants, or you could look for a fundamentally different approach. And that different approach was already waiting in South America. When researchers went to the fire ants' native range in Brazil and Argentina to study why populations there were so much smaller and less aggressive than the American invaders, they found a complex ecosystem of natural enemies. There were pathogens, fungal diseases that spread through ant colonies under the right humidity conditions. There were parasitic nematodes. There were competing ant species, including some native Solenopsis relatives that held specific territories against the invaders in ways that constrained their expansion. And there were flies. Dozens of species of parasitic flies in the genus Pseudactyon, each one specialized to a different aspect of fire ant biology, each one representing millions of years of co-evolution with a single host. These are phorid flies, members of the family Phoridae, and they are among the most effective parasitoids on the planet. The word parasitoid is important here. A parasite lives on or in a host without necessarily killing it. A parasitoid lives on or in a host and always kills it. Phorid flies do not want to share the fire ant. They want to use it, and then they want it dead. The mechanism is specific, and if you are the fire ant, genuinely terrifying. A female pseudaction fly detects a fire ant colony through chemical signals, the same pheromones the ants use to communicate with each other, repurposed by the fly as a targeting system. She hovers above the colony, assessing which ants are the right size. When she identifies a suitable worker, she dives at it. The entire attack takes less than 1/10 of a second. She extends a modified ovipositor and injects a single egg into the ant's thorax, the middle section of the body, where the muscles controlling the legs are housed. Then she pulls away. The ant continues working. It does not know what has happened to it. What happens next unfolds over 2 to 4 weeks and has been mapped in precise detail by researchers. The egg hatches inside the thorax. The larva, which looks like a tiny cream-colored maggot, begins feeding on the ant's internal fluids. As it grows, it migrates toward the head. The migration is not random. The larva is following chemical gradients inside the ant's own body, navigating its way toward the head capsule with a precision that researchers have described as almost architectural. As it migrates, it releases chemical compounds that interfere with the ant's neural function. The ant begins to behave strangely. It wanders away from the colony. It moves in a disoriented, aimless pattern that other ants recognize as wrong. It stops responding to colony pheromones. It has been, in the language of researchers, zombified. The larva continues to feed and grow inside the ant's head capsule, consuming muscles, fat, and eventually the connective tissue holding the head to the body. At some point, usually around 25 to 40 days after the initial egg injection, the larva releases a cocktail of enzymes that dissolves the membrane, connecting the ant's head to its thorax. The head detaches. It falls to the ground. Inside that detached head, the larva pupates, using the hard, chitinous shell of the ant's skull as a protective case. Weeks later, a new adult fly emerges from what used to be a fire ant's head, ready to find a colony and begin the cycle again. The biology is not sensational for shock value. It is sensational because of how precisely it works, and because of what it does to the colony even beyond the individual ants that are parasitized. This is the part of the story that took researchers by surprise. They expected the phorid fly to reduce fire ant populations by killing individual workers. What they found instead was that the fly's effect was disproportionate to the number of ants actually parasitized. When phorid flies are present around a fire ant colony, even at low densities, the foraging behavior of the entire colony changes. Ants that have not been parasitized alter their activity patterns. Foraging drops, trail formation slows. In some studies, surface activity dropped by 40 to 60% when flies were simply hovering in the area, regardless of how many eggs were actually delivered. Why? Because fire ants can smell the fly. The chemical signature of a hovering pseudaction female triggers a colony-wide alarm response. Workers signal each other, trails redirect underground, and the colony essentially goes into lockdown. The fly does not have to parasitize very many ants to affect the entire colony's efficiency. Its mere presence is a management tool. In the fire ant's native South American habitat, this constant threat is part of why colonies there are smaller, more cautious, and less aggressive than their American counterparts. They have been shaped by this pressure for millions of years. They know what the fly means. In America in the 1990s, none of that pressure existed. The fire ants here had been living without their natural enemies for 60 years. They had no fear of phorid flies because they had never encountered them. Their colonies were enormous, their foraging was aggressive, and they had no behavioral inhibition system tuned to this particular threat. That behavioral freedom, the absence of the fear response, is itself part of what makes the American fire ant population so much more economically damaging than its South American counterpart. When you remove a predator from an ecosystem, you do not just remove the deaths the predator would have caused. You remove all the energy the prey would have spent avoiding the predator. Fire ants in America are aggressive, partly because nothing has ever taught them caution. The research team that would change this was based primarily at Texas A&M University, working in partnership with the USDA's Center for Medical, Agricultural, and Veterinary Entomology in Gainesville, Florida. The lead researcher for much of the phorid fly work was a scientist named Sanford Porter, who spent years in South America collecting and studying Pseudactyon species before the actual release work began. What Porter and his colleagues found in the field was that there was not one decapitating fly, but a guild of them, dozens of species, each specializing in slightly different aspects of fire ant biology. Some targeted large workers, some targeted small workers. Some were active in morning hours, others in afternoon. Some preferred disturbed colonies, others preferred foraging trails. The diversity of the parasitoid community in South America was itself a management tool, because it meant the fire ants could never fully adapt to any single threat. For the United States program, researchers had to select species carefully. Any organism released intentionally into a new environment carries the risk of affecting non-target species. This is the lesson of cane toads in Australia, of mongoose in Hawaii, of countless other well-intentioned introductions that became new disasters. The USDA required extensive host specificity testing before any Pseudactyon species could be released. Multiple species were evaluated and rejected before 2 were approved. The first species approved was Pseudactyon tricuspis, a fly roughly 1.5 millimeters in length that specializes in medium and large fire ant workers. Laboratory testing confirmed it would parasitize only Solenopsis invicta and its close relative Solenopsis richteri, showing no meaningful attack rate on the 20-plus native ant species tested. Field releases in Texas began in 1995 at carefully selected sites, with researchers tracking establishment rates, spread, and population effects at each release point. The second species approved was Pseudactyon curvatus, cleared for release in 2001. P. curvatus targets small fire ant workers, the foragers, doing the majority of food collection and trail maintenance. The 2 species together cover a broader portion of the worker caste than either one alone. Where P. tricuspis is present, you have pressure on large workers. Where P. curvatus is established, you have pressure on small workers. The combination creates more complete and sustained suppression across the colony structure. After initial establishment, both species spread on their own. Flies released at a single Texas site in 1995 had established populations detectable over 50 square miles within 5 years. By the early 2000s, researchers were finding established Pseudactyon tricuspis populations at sites where no flies had ever been deliberately released, having arrived through natural dispersal. By 2010, established populations of one or both species were confirmed across much of Texas, Georgia, Florida, and parts of neighboring states. The flies were finding the fire ants on their own. Before we move on to what this actually costs you as a homeowner and what it means for managing fire ants in your own yard, stop for a second. This channel is about low-cost living, not low-effort thinking. If you are watching this and you have fire ants on your property, subscribe and turn on notifications. The next thing we cover is going to matter to your wallet directly. The economic case for biocontrol is straightforward in general terms and difficult to communicate to individual homeowners, because the benefits of forward fly releases are not immediate, not local, and not dramatic in the way that a pesticide application is dramatic. When you spread granular bait on a mound and the colony collapses over the next week, you can see that. You can point to where the mound was. The chemical program delivers a visible, tangible result at a predictable cost. Biocontrol delivers an invisible statistical improvement at no visible cost, and human psychology is not well calibrated to assign value to invisible statistical improvements. What forward flies provide is area-wide suppression. The effect is regional, gradual, and statistical. In areas where both Pseudactyon species are well established, long-term population monitoring studies show fire ant colony density roughly 30 to 60% lower than in comparable untreated areas. The colonies that remain are smaller, less aggressive at the surface, and slower to recover after disturbance. That translates to real savings. Fewer mounds per acre means fewer mound treatments per year. Less aggressive surface foraging means lower rates of human and pet stings. Less overall colony density means slower recolonization of treated areas. The USDA has estimated that if forward fly populations reach the density and diversity of the South American native range, the long-term suppression effect could reduce fire ant management costs by 40% or more across the infested zone. 40% of $6.7 billion is $2.7 billion per year, saved at a total research and release investment that has cost somewhere around $30 to $50 million over 3 decades. No chemical treatment program has approached that return on investment. Now, let's be honest about what the phorid fly program is not, because this is the point where easy storytelling can mislead people into making bad decisions about their own property. The phorid fly does not eliminate fire ants. Researchers have been very clear about this. The goal of biocontrol is not eradication. Solenopsis invicta is too well established, too reproductively capable, and too behaviorally flexible for any single biological agent to eliminate it. The goal is reduction to a level where ants are a manageable background presence rather than a dominant force. Individual mounds appearing in your yard still need to be treated. A colony establishing under your HVAC unit is not going to disappear because a fly has spooked some workers 2 lots over. The flies operate at a landscape scale. Your yard is a microhabitat. There is also the question of what the flies do and do not do to native ant species. The host specificity testing was thorough, and both approved. Pseudactyon species have shown no significant parasitism on native ants in field conditions. But native ant communities in the fire ant-invaded range are already severely disrupted. In areas where fire ants have been present for decades, native ant diversity is often 10 to 50% of historical levels. The phorid flies are being introduced into an ecosystem that has already been restructured, and the interplay between restored fire ant suppression and native ant community recovery is not fully understood. Some researchers believe that as fire ant density drops, native ant species excluded from territories will begin to recover. Others note that the fire ant's deep alteration of soil chemistry and structure complicates that recovery window. This is ongoing science, and the honest answer is that we will not know the full ecological picture for another generation of research. From a low-cost living perspective, the most useful way to think about the phorid fly program is as infrastructure. It is like a road. You did not build it. You did not pay for it directly, or at least not in a way you can see on any bill. But it is there. It makes things more functional, and you benefit from it without necessarily thinking about it. The fly releases that happened in Texas in 1995, and in Georgia, and in Florida, and the slow expansion of established populations across the South over 30 years, that infrastructure is already paying dividends in the form of lower fire ant pressure in established areas than there would otherwise be. What you can do as a homeowner is work with that infrastructure rather than against it. Chemical treatments, particularly broadcast granular insecticides, applied across large areas of soil kill phorid flies. The same non-specific toxicity that makes those products effective against fire ants affects the parasitoid community that has been laboriously established in your county. If you are in Texas, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, or parts of the Carolinas, or Arkansas, there is a reasonable probability that pseudactyon populations are established in your area. Every time you do a large-scale broadcast treatment, you are burning through biological capital that took years to build. This does not mean you cannot treat. It means the choice of product and method matters more than most homeowners realize. Individual mound treatments using targeted products cause minimal disruption to fly populations compared to broadcast treatments. Products applied directly to a specific mound rather than broadcast across the entire yard are more economical in terms of both money spent and beneficial insect impact. The USDA's own extension recommendations for fire ant management in areas with established phorid fly populations have shifted toward two-step programs that use broadcast bait applications minimally once a year at most, and reserve chemical treatments for active mounds near structures, equipment, or areas of high human activity. The cost differential is real. A homeowner who switches from quarterly professional perimeter treatments to a once-per-year broadcast bait application plus targeted mound treatment as needed is looking at a difference in typical Gulf Coast markets of between $200 and $400 per year. Over a decade, that is $2,000 to $4,000. Over the lifespan of a home in fire ant country, the number compounds significantly. That is not a small thing. That is a vacation. That is a semester of community college tuition. That is the difference between running a deficit and breaking even for a family watching every line item. And the reduced treatment approach is not a sacrifice of effectiveness. Multiple independent studies by University Extension Services in Texas, Florida, and Georgia have found that the two-step approach produces fire ant suppression levels statistically comparable to aggressive chemical programs when conducted in areas with established phorid fly populations. The flies are doing part of the work. You do not need to pay for work the flies are already doing. Texas A&M AgriLife Extension maintains one of the most detailed and current online resources for fire ant management available anywhere. Their recommendations are updated as new research comes in and are written for homeowners, not researchers. If you are in Texas and spending significant money on fire ant control, that resource is worth an afternoon of reading. It is free. The recommendations it makes can save you hundreds of dollars a year. Most homeowners spending the most on fire ant control have never read it. The broader picture of where this program is going is genuinely interesting, from both a scientific and economic standpoint. As of the time this script was researched, additional Pseudactyon species are in various stages of host specificity testing and regulatory review. The long-term goal has always been to assemble a guild of parasitoids in the United States that approximates the diversity of fire ant natural enemies in South America, a set of natural checks that keeps fire ant populations below the threshold, where they dominate every other consideration in the environment. That process will take decades. It is already 3 decades old. The fly populations established in the mid-1990s are still there, still expanding, still producing generations of decapitating flies that patrol fire ant territory year-round at no ongoing cost to taxpayers, no ongoing chemical load in the soil. There is something almost philosophically satisfying about the way this solution works. Fire ants succeeded in America partly because they arrived without their natural context. They landed in a world that did not know what they were, that had not spent millions of years learning to respond to them. The phorid fly is the restoration of that context, not a human invention, not a chemical, not a technology, a relationship, a very old, specific, very effective relationship between a predator and its prey, disrupted by an accident of shipping in the 1930s, and slowly, carefully reconstructed by researchers who understood that the most powerful pest control tools are the ones that nature already built. The fly does not care about your budget. It does not send you a bill. It does not require reapplication or label reading or storage away from children. It just finds fire ants and does what it has been doing for millions of years, and the colony is never quite the same again. For a family trying to manage the real costs of living in the American South, the Phorid Fly program is a reminder that the cheapest solutions are often the ones that work with natural systems rather than against them. The most expensive approach to fire ants, the one that costs this country $6.7 billion a year, is the approach that treats it as a chemical problem. The approach that is gradually changing that number treats it as an ecological one. The fly is terrifying if you are a fire ant. If you are a homeowner in Texas trying to keep the ants out of your yard, your pets, and your electrical panel, it is something closer to a miracle. A small, efficient, patient miracle that has been hovering over your county for 30 years, doing its work, one decapitated ant at a time. If you found this useful, share it with someone in fire ant country who is still paying too much for treatments that only half work. Subscribe if you want more content like this: real science, real economics, real strategies for spending less on the problems that cost the most. We will see you in the next one.